Alright, we've hit maximum fancy at this point here. I don't know if we're fancy anymore. I think we're just like extra at this point. But anyways, this is our last list of devices here that are a little bit more common but still very like exotic in the world of rhetorical devices here. A couple more to consider and to find sophistication reserved only for the biggest of brains, of course. Again, I don't really recommend them necessarily on the AP exam. If you can find them though, it become like a regular thing for you. Cool. That means you're actually hella big brain. So here's the first one. Procatalepsis. By anticipating an objection and answering it permits an argument to continue moving forward while taking into account points or reasons opposing either the train of thought or its final conclusions. It's kind of like hyperphora, essentially, right? Procatalepsis is hyperphora, but rather than ask a question than answering it, is asking a question that you know the audience is going to ask you and then addressing it there. We see this a lot in debates, and we see this a lot in kind of like arguments where the person is maybe talking about something more controversial or what have you. So in this one, this is dialogue essentially, right? But if you can see the example of procatalepsis in action here, the person says, "Listen, Liz, I know this is tough to hear, but..." And she says, "I know what you're going to say." She cut in, her voice quiet. "I know what you're going to tell me to do. Accept it, move on, try to forget about what happened to him." He didn't respond. She second-guessed him. "Right?" "Right." "Well, it's not so easy for me," she said. "I'm still here in London with all the memories, living next door to his empty house," and so forth and so on. So you can see how Liz knew that this person was going to say this particular piece, counters it, and it takes away all his ethos and his like points, right? Because she knows already, and it kind of shows that this speaker is open-minded enough, understands enough what the other side is probably going to say here. In his speech, this is Frederick Douglass, an appeal to the British people. He says, "I may be asked why I'm so anxious to bring this subject before the British public. Why I do not confine my efforts to the United States. My answer is, first, that slavery is the common enemy of mankind." And that's a good question, right? Because he's talking about slavery, but he's in Britain. And it's kind of like, well, you're an American guy, Frederick Douglass. Why are you not speaking in America? And he's like, "I know you're going to ask that, so I'm going to address that right now." And what it does is it's kind of like a preemptive, attack, I guess, to defend against the questions and to, again, bring up a point that you're going to bring up anyways before someone asks and take away some of your power here. So it's a very ethos type of technique here. Anacoluthon. Basically, it's lacking sequence. And it's a stylistic device defined as a syntactic deviation and interruption within a sentence from one structure to another. And this is kind of like a red herring of the technique. A lot of people will use this to divert conversation or to kind of bring an extra point here. You'll see this a lot in like, what do you call it? I guess news, right? You'll see a lot in news where they're trying to shift the conversation or to bring up a talking point that they want to here. Example, athletes convicted of drug-related crimes. Are they to be forgiven with just a slap on the wrist? What? Forgiven? When were we talking about that, right? Like, that's kind of an issue to actually talk about here and to warrant something more than just a slap on the wrist. So you see how this person uses this technique here to shift from, well, what seems to be a lead up of talking about the various penalties and issues surrounding athletes using drugs, and then they're going to ask the question of like, well, should we just forgive them a slap on the wrist? Well, how do we get there, right? It's a diverting technique here, again, kind of like a red herring, essentially. So it's kind of like in the world of logical fallacies. Give me a second, let me just make sure that, it's whatever. I forgot I wasn't using headphones this time, so I was wondering where my headphones were. So I wasn't sure it was distracting, but it's fine. Congery is a form of tautology, the rhetorical use of repetition. It refers to a writer or a speaker using a number of different and successive words or phrases that all effectively mean the same thing, purely to emphasize the point. If you remember, this is for the third period, when you guys were doing your rhetorical quiz. Third period had fifth period had a speech from Malcolm X, and he talks about like how the African American community has been ruined and damaged by the white government, essentially, white male government, and he says things like, "We've been hoodwinked, bamboozled." So that's congery. It's another example. That's it. That's all. Done. Finished. Finito, right? I'm just kind of like making that extra emphasis there so you know that we're done, essentially, there. So it's kind of like a form of repetition, but it's to make emphasis through restatement and various forms of saying it there. Anthropomorphism. This is going to be, again, more for Parables, allegories here. We all know personification, I hope. Personification is when you give like objects human qualities here, but anthropomorphism goes another level where it gives them human qualities that are, I guess, literal in this case here, that they're actually doing human things, right? And it's almost like they have a consciousness, or they have like human behaviorisms. So if you think about like Beauty and the Beast, these characters here, these everyday objects are given, faces, the ability to feel and think and speak and all that. Anthropomorphism. You see this a lot when authors are trying to use more kind of like metaphorical or symbolic, or again, kind of like that more abstract type of language or storytelling to get a point across there. You'll see this again more in parables and allegories and all that. Alice in Wonderland is a common one here. Various weird characters will show up. For example, the caterpillar or the rabbit, and just really everybody was not everybody. A lot of people are anthropomorphic in there, and they're all to like represent a certain like mannerism or a certain kind of trope of society there. Last one, synesthesia. In literature, synesthesia refers to a technique adopted by writers to present ideas, characters, or places in such a manner that they appeal to more than one sense, like hearing, sight, smell, and touch at a given time. We sometimes like to mix up senses because it gives us like a kind of broader depth of understanding here. If you look at the first example, the bright field of wildflowers smell like purple, magenta, yellow, white, and green. You can't obviously smell colors, but in this case, you almost can, right? Because it's so overwhelming, all these colors here, that you have to absorb it in a different way than just smell. It's also from sight in this case here. The stars sound like piles of diamonds, and we can't hear stars because they're so far off, right? But in this case, the author wanted to give us kind of another way to approach stars rather than just seeing them and experiencing that way, to also perhaps hear them in that visual turnout audio there. So this is more like a stylistic choice. It's more for like to flower up and to create certain fancy forms of imagery here. It's just to have us like again understand, I guess, the world around us here, and to kind of give it more depth and width there. So I chose the shortest presentation for the shades because I can't really see these slides that well, but otherwise this is the last set of the fancies for you there. And if you have all these under your belt too, then you are now at the level of master fancy, and I commend you, but you don't need these. They're nice to have, but you don't, again, need them.